We often talk about writing your first cookbook, but what about writing more than a dozen? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Molly Stevens, and today, Kristin Donnelly and I are talking to a cookbook author who needs no introduction, Dorie Greenspan. Kristin, do you remember when you first became aware of Dorie's books?
It's funny, I don't remember a single moment. I felt like I was just aware. By the time I worked at Food and Wine magazine, people would talk about Dorie with just her first name. Dorie does this, Dorie does it this way, Dorie says this. So I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, she's been writing books and winning awards for as long as I've been writing about food. In fact, I remember when I was just starting out, I heard Dorie at a conference, and I've never forgotten what she told the audience about recipe writing. She explained how she envisions every little detail of making something. And she would like kind of close her eyes and was moving her hands. And she talked about the sights and the sounds and the sensations and how then she puts those down on the page for the readers. It's like she's trying to put herself right there in the kitchen with you. And I've never forgotten that.
She's amazing, the level of detail in her recipes and how creative she is and just always creating. And not only recipes in her books, but online. I mean, she is always trying something new. She's done Substack. She has Facebook groups. She's very big on Instagram. So it just shows, social media and being online, it's not just for young authors. I mean, it's for people who have longevity as well.
Right. Well, for any listeners who may not know Dorie Greenspan, she has authored 14 books over 3 decades. She's known mostly for her baking books, but Dorie has been inducted into the who's who of food and beverage in America. She's had columns in the New York Times, the Washington Post. She's won multiple awards, and her books have been on bestsellers list. Her newest book, Baking with Dorie, Sweet, Salty, and Simple, came out in 2021. Dorie, hello. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks. It is such a joy to have you here today.
I'm so happy to be with the two of you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
We're thrilled.
Thank you for saying yes. I've been looking forward to this interview for quite a while. So excuse me if I'm a little excited, amped up, but I once heard you say, there's really only one reason to write a recipe, and that's to help people be successful. I was so struck by this. And Dorie, your recipes, you have so much precision and vivid detail, and yet they're also filled with this encouragement and what I think of as kitchen sense. I mean, I think about the pear and comté tart in your new book, where you talk about how you lay out the pear slices. And I'm just wondering, what is your, this is a big question, but your process for achieving that voice, that level of detail?
Gee, it's funny. Have I ever thought about it in those terms? I'm not sure I have. So I am not trained. And perhaps that helps because in some way, every time I do something, I'm learning it. And so I feel like both student and teacher at the same time. It really does go back to wanting people to succeed. And, we all make mistakes. I've made so many of them. So I'm always afraid to say, we've all had that experience where we're all excited. We go shopping, we buy the ingredients, we spend the time, we make something, and it doesn't work. And it's really terrible. And when that happens to me, I'm upset. And if I cause that to happen to someone, it's terrible. And so I really do try to get it right. Try to give people as much information, as much detail, as many visual or tactile clues as I can so that they can be successful.
Mm-hmm. When you're writing a recipe for the first time, is it often with that level of detail, or does the testing process also bring in more of that?
That's interesting. I work in a notebook, pencil and paper. And so my first tests are like, there are words, there are splatters, there are arrows, there are little diagrams. Sometimes there's a little drawing. They're kind of a mess. So, but I do, as I'm working, write little notes like this separated, or this takes, X amount of time to come together, or I can remember writing that a batter was ugly. So I take little notes. I mean, when I started doing this, we didn't have smartphones, and we didn't have digital cameras, and so I wasn't taking pictures of everything. And even now, I'll take pictures of something if it's unusual, but mostly I'm just working and writing. And so I have to get that first draft done fairly quickly after I make the recipe for the first time, so that I don't lose all of those little notes and ideas and things that I've seen. Then I'll keep working on the recipe and send it off to be tested.
The cranberry pecan loaf, for example. So that pops into your head, that idea, that inspiration,
right.
And then is it into the kitchen to bake it, or is it scratching down the flavors and the few things, and they're both happening at the same time?
So it kind of all happens at once. So listeners can't see, but my desk is my kitchen is my office. I'm in one big room. And so sometimes I'll be sitting working at my desk and I'll have an idea, and I'll just my chair, I'm on a chair that has wheels. My chair has been known to be flung into the living room, which is to the left of my desk. I'll jump up and think, oh, do I have the ingredients? Can I start? And so I'll start writing and working at the same time. I am not as organized as I look or as I hope I sound when it's all over. And so things happen in this kitchen kind of on a whim. And I have the luxury of being able to do that because I'm always working at home.
Yeah.
You know, it makes it possible to just jump up and make a cranberry pecan loaf.
One of the things I'm finding doing this podcast is we outlined at the very beginning sort of the way a book is traditionally put together. And I swear to a person, our guests come on and say, well, I didn't do it that way. And I once heard you say, I think you were talking to Julia Turshen on her Keep Calm and Cook On podcast, that when you write a proposal, you don't have a recipe list, or it's not what it ends up being, or you don't really have a roadmap when you're starting a book?
All of those things.
Okay. Yeah, that's amazing.
It's amazing that anything gets done given that kind of confusion, but it wasn't always that way. I mean, some of it, I hope my editors aren't listening. Some of it is because they let me get away with it. They don't say we need a perfect roadmap. It would be so much more comfortable. I have done books where I've written a very detailed proposal where I listed 200 recipes and I think I made 150 of them. I do list recipes, but often I don't make them. And everything changes as I'm working and as I'm inspired by something else. And I've been so lucky because I've worked with such wonderful people who've allowed me to deviate from what I said I was going to do originally. And so I will jump up and make a cranberry pecan loaf, and it becomes part of the book. And I might not know until it's all over what I've got. I remember Julia, if I'm remembering correctly, has beautiful lists. And in my next life, I will too. I want them. Them. I just...
I love it though, because it sounds like it's this chaos perhaps going on in the work behind the scenes. But what we get is just so thoughtful, so detailed, so clean and
cohesive.
Cohesive, yes.
Thank you. It's not, I make it sound like I'm not a scientist at all in any way, but like I'm some mad, person in the kitchen just popping up and doing things. Obviously I have an idea. I'm looking at Baking with Dorie, and I was going to say, obviously I have an idea of what the chapters will be, but that wasn't the case with this book at all. So maybe not this example. But, I have a sense of what the book will be. It's just you never know when you're going to have an idea. In my first book, not my first book, it was like, who knows what number it was, but in Baking from My Home to Yours, which I think is my first book because it's the first book I did with Rux Martin at Houghton Mifflin, and I've done many after that. The recipe that ended up on the cover was one that I did when I thought the book was done.
Wow.
Everything was ready to be submitted, and I made this cake, and I wrote it, and slipped it into one of the chapters and it became the cover. I feel like if I didn't have a deadline, I would never finish a book. Don't you feel this way? Like there's always something else. There's the next idea. There's the next thing you saw in a pastry shop that you think, oh, I could turn that into a pie. And so, thank goodness for deadlines.
Well, it's interesting. It's such a creative spark. We were talking recently to an editor about what they look for in a proposal, and it's almost impossible to articulate, but it's this, how you create something that is very filled with life and yet is a solid object of a book. And somehow I think in this process, you are bottling that lightning, Dorie.
I would love to think of it that way, but when I'm in the midst of it doesn't feel that way at all. I mean, I had a really good list and a proposal for Baking from My Home to Yours. I had a list for Around My French Table, and after that, I don't know what happened to me. Who knows? But I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and I have, I don't know, Molly, how many books? I think 14. It gets easier a little bit and harder a lot.
Harder? Why harder?
The first time you do something, it's all excitement. It's all possibility. It's all the future. It's all learning something new. And as you keep working and you have work behind you, it's not that you're in competition with yourself, but in some way you are. You've done work, you want to do better. You want to bring everything new to the next project. And so it does get harder. And sometimes I find that I plagiarize myself. No, really, because you think, chocolate and banana. I'm just, what a great combination. Oh, I have 6 chocolate and banana cakes already. It's, to find something new, to find a new way of presenting it, to find something that excites me, because if it doesn't excite me, it's not going to excite readers. So it does get harder.
Yeah, Molly and I were talking about how, because your recipes are so reliable, and what the New York Times on the cooking app, the headline is, "You can never go wrong with Dorie," and there's this promise of a Dorie recipe.
I'm so glad I've never seen that.
Oh, geez. No pressure.
Wow.
But that's a lot of pressure.
Just keep your eyes closed.
Yeah.
No, it's wonderful to have. I mean, I think I'm one of the luckiest people around because I've had the opportunity to do this work for so long. But it's a lot to look back on. And as I said, to find what's new. But I think it's tell me if you feel this way, it's what we try and do in our lives in general. And I think it's part of what made the pandemic so difficult for all of us, that we had to find the new within very confined spaces and contexts.
That's so true.
I mean, I often think that just cooking dinner, if you have a somewhat routine life, cooking dinner is the one thing that can really change it up. You can, have the same job, the same, 4 walls, the same people you're with, but dinner could take you anywhere,
Yeah.
And
so true,
I mean,
Molly.
your stuff is more of baking, but still same thing. Making a batch of cookies can change the whole day, or making a brioche or something. It's just how we can add. For those of us who are food centric, which clearly the 3 of us are.
That's I couldn't agree with you more. There's also the sense of, it's not the sense, it's the reality of making something, of producing something that you hold and something that you share. I mean, this has become kind of a cliche about food being handmade, but I certainly always felt that. And I felt the sense of accomplishment at making something magnified during the pandemic. Baking with Dorie, which was my last book, was really a pandemic book.
Meaning you wrote it during the pandemic?
Yeah, I was working on it during the pandemic, and it was in some ways my supermarket book, as in a way Everyday Dorie was as well, but for different reasons. And so I think it made it a stronger book because, I couldn't be traveling around. My stuff is never that fancy. I think, and never, so I'm never calling for ingredients, or rarely, that are really hard to find. But this was definitely, go to the supermarket, shop very quickly, come home, you can do it. It really forced me to be very practical and creative. Sometimes I think being constrained in some way forces you to be more creative.
100%.
Putting parameters.
Yeah. There's sometimes two types of people: the people who are like more creative with those constraints, and those who really can't stand them and need to be totally unconstrained. But I love some boundaries.
It's like a problem solving.
I've talked about this a little bit before, but when I wrote Dorie's Cookies, I was so excited. 200 cookie recipes. This was going to be... And then when I started to work, I thought, 200, what did I promise? How is it possible that I will be able to do 200? And cookies, one subject. I had that panic moment. And the more I worked on cookies, the more I was defining what a cookie was for me, the more ideas I had for cookies. So again, that idea that being constrained in some way can free you and make you more creative.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good tip, actually, in a way. It's like, if cookies feels too broad, what about chocolate cookies? Or what about, drop cookies? And then getting even more narrow than that to create from there.
Yeah. And I find single subject endlessly interesting, because the deeper, it's like so many things, the deeper you go into a topic, the more you learn about it. That's great advice.
There was something you said in your most recent book. Here are these basic ingredients, and here's this recipe, and you can do it. And Molly and I were remarking that you can do it is very much part of you. You're just this natural cheerleader for your reader. But I also wanted to bring up a head note that I read in the book Gâteau by Alexandra Crapenzano. She wrote, "When I decided to write this book, I emailed Dorie, aware that Paris and baking are very much her territory. I didn't want to encroach and was prepared to back right off. But she emailed in response that very night, adamant that I must write it, with must underlined." Just love it. Like that generosity.
I don't own Paris, and I don't own, I don't own cakes. And it was very touching that Alexandra had written to me. She went on to write such a wonderful book. The book is so beautiful. It's wonderful to bake from. It's also so lovely to read. Alexandra, she's a beautiful writer.
Yeah, I think Kristin mentions it every other podcast episode.
Yeah, because
Kristin's in love with that book.
Just in the past couple of weeks, I'm just like, I just love it.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book.
But where did that abundance mentality come from? Your urge to encourage others? Like, were there people early on who did it for you, or it's just who you are?
What an odd question. I don't know. I think I was very lucky that I had, I've been married. I tease and say I was born and then I got married. So I've been married for a very long time to Michael, who really encouraged me. I mean, this was not what I was trained to do. This was not what I thought I would do. I went to graduate school in gerontology. I never expected to be a baker. I never expected to be a writer. And he really encouraged me to do this. And I've had the chance to work with people who've been so encouraging, and people who, I'm thinking of a work that I did very early on after school, where it never occurred to me I could write. The person I was working for said, "Would you write the report for our group?" And I was just stunned and I was nervous. I did it. And it was good enough for her. And she encouraged me to do more. I mean, I think we all, no, maybe not all of us, maybe just people like me, need someone to encourage them. I don't think it's easy to just jump out of the box and say, this is what I'm doing. And each stage I've had either an editor or somebody I've worked with who said, you can do it.
Yeah.
For me, I think that encouragement, when it's something I didn't know that I love to do, someone encourages me and it lights a spark. Like you're just, before you're fully formed, or if we're ever fully formed, but you're just trying to figure it out. And for me, it was writing, and someone early on encouraged me to keep doing it. And I'm sure I had been encouraged to do a million things, but I didn't care because that wasn't what I really wanted to do. And so it was someone seeing something in me that I secretly wanted or something, but I don't know if I'm being articulate
No,
about it.
you're very
that makes sense.
articulate. And it's making me think about how Michael says that he can remember, he's known me since I'm 16. And he says he can remember my saying that I wanted to write. I don't ever remember saying those words out loud.
Right.
But to have gotten that encouragement right after college, then to have I found writing and I found baking almost simultaneously, cooking, and being in the kitchen, making things, making food, sharing it with people, having people come to the house and making dinner for them. I found that all at once. It took me I went to graduate school, I worked, I did many other things before I thought, okay, this is really I had a baby. This is really what I want to do.
It's interesting you talk about that bringing people together. And another thing that is really remarkable about what you've done is your community building. You talk about making things and you're also making books as well.
Yes.
So you're baking and making, but you're also making books. And so part of that encouragement with making books so others can make things, for example, Tuesdays with Dorie that was started outside. You didn't start it, but you certainly engaged with it. And you engage with your community in a way that encourages it to grow as well.
I want to say, of course, because, of course, I mean, who wouldn't? I find it remarkable. And I think in many ways, because I didn't grow up thinking I would do this, because I didn't grow up with the internet. I didn't grow up with any sense that this would happen. I'm still, after all these years, amazed by it. I'm amazed by how community forms. I'm amazed by how generous people are. There's this group that I started on Facebook called Bake and Tell. And I always say it's the sweetest corner of the internet. It's on Facebook, and Facebook sends you this list of things you have to tell your group members. They must be civil. They must be polite. And I'm thinking, I have never had anything. No one has ever said, oh, so-and-so wasn't nice to me, or this is wrong. I feel like this is the power of food and the power of sweets. But I find it remarkable that we can now be sharing information and ideas and encourage one another around the world.
Yeah.
Every day I feel like, oh, I just discovered that this can happen. And I find it remarkable. And I'm delighted if anything that I do keeps this together, because it's wonderful.
We really admire the way you play around with recipes and food, but also with this community building. And you have the Facebook group, as you mentioned, and now a Substack newsletter, right?
Yeah, XOXO Dorie. I'm laughing because I'm remembering that, it was when I wrote Around My French Table. At that point, I had a blog. The Tuesdays with Dorie group had started. I was on a food forum, eGullet, that was,
Oh, yeah, I remember eGullet. Yeah, sure do.
And I remember turning some work in to my editor, Rux Martin, and she said, remember, this is for a book, not a blog. And in the time between writing Baking from My Home to Yours and 4 years later, Around My French Table, I must have gotten so caught up with what was happening online that she felt that it had changed my writing.
And that sounds like it was a criticism.
It was a criticism. I never think of my writing as being formal, but I evidently was, and when I went back, I saw it, way too familiar, too shorthand.
Like chatty.
Too bloggy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was a real moment for me to think about my writing.
So if you're working on a book and blogging at the same time, do you stop blogging if you're working on a book?
No, I feel like I've now grown into being a single person. I don't think that my writing is all that different these days in my newsletter and my book writing or the work that I did for the Times. But there was, I guess I was just so caught up. and so excited about finding a new group of friends that I had trouble separating the two forms of writing.
When you spoke with Julia Turshen, you talked about how somebody shared a picture of, I think it was a bundt cake or some cake on eGullet. And it's funny how we just forget how novel that was not that long ago, to have somebody share a photo of your recipe.
It was, I can remember I was in my office in New York looking out the window. My computer was in front of the window. I saw this and I ran out and got Michael and brought him into my office. You have to see this. And then I started to cry.
Happy tears.
Yeah, happy tears, very happy tears. But, in the before days, you wrote and your book was published and you went to a library and saw it, or you went to a bookstore and rearranged the shelves so that the one copy of the book was face out and someone would see it, and you knew your mother bought it. But you had no idea, unless it was your next door neighbor or your best friend, that anyone was using the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially going back to what you talked about at the beginning, that every recipe is a promise to someone that they're going to make. You want to know that they're having that success, but there was no way to know.
There was no way to know.
Yeah.
It was thrilling.
Amazing.
It was nice to be at the birth of to make that change from before to what we see now.
Yeah. And embrace it. It seems like you just have so much fun with it.
I still marvel at it. And I'm in awe of how talented so many people are. It's exciting to see what people are doing and how well they're doing it.
And we have access to it by flipping through, scrolling through Instagram, or, you in your introduction to your newest book, you talk about posting something on Instagram, and that's what inspired the whole book. It was the cheese scone.
That's right. I was in Santa Barbara. I had the scone. I posted it, and Ann Ma said, you should write a book on savory baking.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Instagram.
Well, thank you, Dorie. Okay, we've established it's 14 books. It's over 3 decades as a cookbook author, but before that, you were a magazine writer. You were doing freelance magazine work. So
yes,
it's quite a run. You've not only been writing cookbooks for over 3 decades, but in the past 11 years, you've had 6 pretty big cookbooks, plus that short stack edition.
Oh, butter.
That's, if you do the math, that's more than one book every 2 years. That's incredible. How do you do that?
No, is it really?
Well, something like that.
I'll take your word for it, but it doesn't feel the way. I think how you do it is you do it. You do the work. But I feel like I'm really lucky. I was talking to Michael a couple of months ago and I said, maybe I should just retire. No, I was thinking we have grandchildren now. I could, spend more time with the kids. And Michael said, you would be impossible to live with. I love the work. I love coming in the morning and knowing that I have it to do. I love being totally caught up in the work where you're working on something and the world does disappear and you're surprised when you look up and find out what time it is. I just find, after all these years, I still find this work endlessly interesting and engrossing and changing. Mm-hmm. I did have a good run. I'm happy. I feel incredibly lucky to, first of all, to have found it, because it wasn't the work I thought I was going to do, to have found people who want the work, and to be able to continue to do this work and to continue to find it interesting. That's pretty swell.
It is.
Yeah, it really is.
I did do magazine work. You're right. I'm thinking back that I didn't do much of it. It was so hard to get the work for me in the beginning, but it was so exciting. And our son was in school and we had to pay tuition. And so every time I got an article, I looked at it as units of tuition. Yeah. One time I was able to pay for a week of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It wasn't always easy.
Yeah.
A lot of our listeners are first-time authors trying to break in, and they often ask about co-authoring as a way to get started. And when you started out, you certainly worked on both. You had some incredible collaborative projects.
I did.
I think even went back and forth between, your first book, Paris Sweets, was your own, but then Baking with Julia, your work with Pierre Hermé. And I'm just curious about your role as a co-author and how these projects might have affected your own work or your evolution.
When my favorite line, when I worked with Julia Child.
That's a good one.
When I was asked to write the book for the Baking with Julia television series, I was thrilled. Oh, I was anxious every minute of that because I always felt like no matter what I did, it was going to be Julia's book, and I wanted it to be good for Julia. But I found that I loved working on other people's recipes. I felt like a translator then, that I was taking their work, and it was, complicated chefs. The book was 26 bread bakers and pastry chefs recipes. I was taking their professional recipes and finding a way to translate them for the home baker. And I loved that work. And it was because I loved that work so much that I went on to do the books with Pierre Hermé and Danielle Boulou. And each experience was different. It's such a different experience. I mean, you're working with somebody else's material. Chefs are busy people. Sometimes they have time for you and can tell you, oh, this recipe, my mother used to make it and others times you have to just imagine where this came from. You can't just jump up from your desk and make a cranberry pecan loaf. You're on somebody else's schedule all the time. I learned an extraordinary amount working on those books, but it was a struggle. It was a struggle to be a co-author. I think it's a fascinating way to learn. It's a great way to get started. It's also really hard. And I wonder, did it help me learn to work? I mean, if it were my first project, would it have changed the way I work? Would it have taught me how to work? Maybe, I'm not sure.
Or just how you didn't want to work?
Well, I would do any of those projects all over again because of what I learned certainly from Julia and the pastry chefs, but what I learned from Pierre Hermé and Danielle Boulou. I think my cooking certainly got better. Danielle said to Michael when we told him that I was going to be doing this project, Danielle said to Michael, my husband, he said, your wife is about to become a better cook. And he was right. Being in the kitchen, working with those chefs, I learned a tremendous amount. So for a learning experience, but it is everybody. I've heard stories from other co-writers that have been dream stories and others that are, pull the hair out of your head kinds of stories. I think I was lucky. Yes, it was harder than working on my own.
Mm-hmm. And you've worked with a number of editors, too, and different publishers. I believe Maria Guarnaschelli was your first editor?
My first editor, yeah.
You certainly learn how to put a book together.
Oh, I learned so much from her. I remember when I turned in my first little bit of work to her, she read one head note and just handed everything back to me. It had some momentum behind it as it went across the desk. And she gave it back to me and she said, I want to know about the taste. I want to know about the texture. Is there a technique I need to know about? That's what I want in the head note. And I have carried that with me all of these years. I feel like in the years that I've been writing, the style has changed for sure. My writing, what I want to tell people has changed. I think I have more to tell people than I had when I wrote my first book. But she taught me so much. She said, I don't care what you have for Sunday lunch. That's not going to help me make this recipe. And it really kept me focused on thinking about what does a reader need to know to go into the kitchen.
Mm-hmm. Remarkable.
Yeah.
She was an extraordinary person and editor. Yeah.
And then you had Rux Martin was your longtime editor, right?
Yes. Small but mighty. Rux and I are the same. Yeah. You never go into a book knowing everything you need to know about it. And it's impossible to write a book and not learn from the entire process. And Rux is a brilliant editor. And she made everything I ever did better. and help me be better as I was working.
And now you have a new editor, right, Dorie?
I have a new terrific editor. Sarah Kwok is my editor now that Rux is no longer at the house. And I worked with Sarah for a while because she was Rux's assistant. So it's wonderful to have a great editor who's someone you've worked with before.
And who's been mentored by somebody you worked with for so long.
That too. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You and I were just talking about this earlier today, Dorie, about how we all need editing. I mean, to have a relationship and a long-term relationship, I think, with an editor is something that can really just help your career evolve. And it's a remarkable thing if you can maintain it.
It makes such a difference to have someone who knows your work. As a writer, to have someone you can work with, that you can trust, that will help you, that's really on your side. I think editing is it's such a difficult job. Your job, the way I think that our job as cookbook authors is to help people succeed in the kitchen. An editor's job is to help her or his writers succeed. And I think it's very hard. You're taking someone else's work. You haven't been there to shape it. You can't put your voice on it. It's a very difficult job. And I think it's so important.
It's very well said.
And I think that the really good editors of course, they take it seriously. But imagine being able to work on your book, Molly, on your book, Kristin, on my book. We're three different writers. We work in different ways. What we produce is different. And to be able to make each of our works better. It's an extraordinary skill to be a good editor.
Yeah.
And to care that much as well.
That's right.
We're talking about long term. I don't think we can let you go without talking about Mary Dodd. I mean, talk about a long-term relationship that makes your work better.
Yes. I was going to say when I said, it's great to have an editor who knows your history. It's great to have a recipe tester who knows your work. So Mary and I have been together since baking chez moi. I think Mary told me the other day that we've been working together since 2011. Yeah. And so, I can call Mary and say, do you remember that cake that I made? The one that I was upset that it had a crack down the center. Do you remember which cake it was and how I fixed it? She'll know and she'll say, look at the testing notes. Remember we did this or we did that. You changed this. And then once again, I know I've said it before, but I feel really lucky. I've always had good people to test my recipes, but to have Mary, who's so good at what she does, and to have this long-term relationship.
I also love the story I've heard of Mary coming up to you in the farmer's market. Like, if you ever need help, and you're like, I don't need help.
I don't need help. Well,
I'm fine.
I didn't at the time. I didn't know that minutes later I would be desperate for help.
But I'm often telling people, like, put it out there, and you never know. Somebody might say, actually, I do need this help.
But you were working with other testers before?
Yeah, I've had people work with me on all of my books. But once there was Mary Dodd.
And at what point does Mary get a recipe from you?
So at this point, Mary knows my work so well that she could take an early version and make it right. But I don't do that. I try to send Mary the recipe when I think it's done. And so I try to send it to her, not only when I think the formula is right. In other words, I have the right amount of flour, sugar, butter, whatever. But when I think that I've written the body of the recipe right, so that she has all of the clues. I mean, I know that I could give her my notes and she could turn it into, a layer cake. But I want her to be testing the writing as well as I want her to say, you said it looked marbly, but I didn't find that. Or, I want her to have all of that information.
Right. Like I'm thinking of the Swedish cake, and in the instructions you say, when the timer dings, look at it. And if it looks a certain way, start the topping. If it looks another way, hold off on the topping. And that is like you are there in the kitchen with us. And I'm imagining, Mary's making it and it didn't look that way. So she comes back to you. So you build in.
Yeah.
Because that all happens.
It's not at all the same as having a community out in the world, but I think this should not be solitary work. We need people to taste our food and tell us what their opinions are. Though I have to say, I don't always change something if someone doesn't like it.
Sure.
If I like it and my trusted tasters like it, I'll keep it. But I think we need people to taste things. We need people to test things. We need people to read our work. I don't think you can write a cookbook in your kitchen without ever coming out. And I'm lucky to have good people around me.
That is very, very well said. Well, we could talk for quite a while, and we've already said we wish we were doing it at a cafe somewhere.
Somewhere being Paris.
Yes, but we just so appreciate you coming on and speaking with us. And we'll put links to all your books and ways for people to find you if they don't already know. But if there anything specific you want to mention or any parting words for aspiring authors or voracious sweet tooths or sweet teeth, however you say that.
Right. For aspiring authors. It's really important. Today I was talking to someone who said, I want to write, but I'm timid. She said, even when I'm writing in my journal, I'm wondering if this is what I should say.
Oh, wow.
And it struck me because I think this is the way many of us feel. But if you want to write, the only way to write is to write. And I think that today, being able to have a newsletter, being able to have a website, being able to write online gives us the opportunity that when I started wasn't possible. It was a catch-22. In order to get an article published, you had to have an article. You needed clips. You had to be able to show people something. And now writers have the opportunity to make their future. They have the opportunity to start writing for themselves and have their own portfolio that they can then present. I think it's a really exciting time to write. I think there's a readership that's limitless. It's really important, if this is what you want to do it now, right after we say goodbye, now.
There you go. It's beautiful.
You heard it here. Turn off your everything cookbooks and go write something.
Fantastic. It was wonderful spending time with you.
Thank you, Dorie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Abby Circatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.